In some museums, museum labels, if there are enough personnel, may fall under the responsibilities of the exhibitions personnel. You may actually have an individual separate from the curator who writes the text for the labels. In other museums, you're doing it yourself. So that's what we'll be talking about today, is museum labels in preparation for the next part of your semester project. And on Wednesday, the first part of the class, we'll be talking about support text for labels, which will be much more elaborated than the museum labels that we're talking about today. And I promise you that your next quiz will relate to support text. So this should be up on YouTube by this evening. There's a little bit of a lag between when I record and when it gets encoded, and then uploading it, and then having the link to be able to plug it in. So it should be up by this evening, though. And for next Monday, you are to read Chapter 8 in the Marstein text, which talks about the critical museum visitor. And it is indeed the critical museum visitor that we need to be thinking about when we are writing labels for our objects, for our exhibits, as well as for any type of supporting materials that we are using in an exhibit. So once again, Chapter 8 in Marstein for next Monday. As we are considering labels, it's important to really reflect upon who we are as an entity, as an institution, because we, as entities and institutions, we draw certain type of clientele. That people are coming to our museum for specific reasons, and it is because they have an interest in what we're doing. And so we need to be very audience aware. So there are very few random acts of museum visiting. You know, people aren't just walking around and all of a sudden get sucked in the door of a museum. All right, it doesn't happen at random. People are making decisions because they are measuring the time that they're going to spend at a museum, for example, as compared to doing some other activity. And that's why very often, you know, so we're looking at not only a term that came out with capitalism that was called disposable income, which means that you have money to spend beyond what you need to sustain yourself. We also have what you might call spare time, downtime, vacation. And that when people have that kind of time available, they're making choices about what they're going to do with that time, say when they're on vacation. Now, a lot of people actually choose to waste their time and sit in front of a television. But there are other people that actually like to get out and do things. And when you are a museum and you are in any urban area and even in a reservation area, people are making decisions about what to do. All right, so do you want to go to the amusement park or do you want to go to the museum? That's why in museums, a very important idea, not only a participatory museum, where people have a much larger say as visitors in what's going on, but I mentioned a term earlier in the semester, edutainment, that people actually enjoy themselves as they're learning. And so when you're asking yourself, as a curator, you know, when you're thinking about writing labels, all right, what kind of entity are you? Because you're going to be drawing a certain kind of clientele, which means that the labels that you write have to be tailored to the broadest cross-section of people within that clientele that you plan to attract. So you might have, if you're a children's museum, for example, and we have a children's museum in Santa Fe, if you look at the labels on any of the things over at the Children's Museum, you'll see they're very different from the labels that you would see not a little bit over a mile away at the museum circle there. You know, where the Wheelwright and the School of American Research, or I'm sorry, the Laboratory of Anthropology, and what's that? The Folk Art Museum. All right, that whole cluster, that whole museum complex, those labels there are going to be very different than what you'll see at Children's Museum. because they are tailoring labels to fit the clientele. So who are you, not only as a curator, but as an institution, and who is your museum? And then, in a very real way, based on your awareness of who you are, the clientele that you attract, you're really thinking about the language that you are using as you are writing labels. And yeah, so we can talk bilingual or trilingual, but we're also talking about the readability. And it's a good idea, and I completely spaced on bringing the link, because there are various, and I want you to write this word down because I didn't put it on here. It's called Readability Index. Readability Index. And that lets you know, in essence, what age range the language that you are using is going to be understandable by. For example, if you take most newspaper articles, and I'm not saying write labels like a newspaper article. That'll be drier than hell. But if you were to take a paragraph out of a newspaper article and you do a readability index on it, you'll find that it's tailored to someone reading at the 8th grade level. The language that's being used is going to be to appeal to someone at 8th grade level. So there are various types of labels that we are constructing in any exhibit. Now, you are all doing small subsections of what would be a larger exhibit. All right, you're all getting, in essence, if we were to take the Primitive Edge Gallery and instead say that's the Primitive Edge Museum, and then the little space that you're in, that you'd be planning for, would be the gallery within the museum. Remember, we talked about galleries being display spaces. All they're going to have different themes or content inside the whole museum as an institution. So if you were to think of your little area that you'd be planning for as a gallery, then you would be aware that outside of that gallery, there would be text that people would encounter that would orient them to entering that space, so they'd know what to expect. So your introduction labels are going to be the first label or labels that visitors are going to see. And they should explain this particular display or exhibit in a very general sense. So when the next exhibit opens up at the Primitive Edge Gallery, as you'll walk, you've all been over there, that's correct? At least once. When you walk in the door, you'll usually see introductory text, or at least the title, at that very first panel as you walk in. Sometimes you'll see more explanatory text on the walls to either side. So it depends on the nature of the objects that are being displayed. But that label really should be a teaser, right? That it actually talks about the main sections of the exhibit that will encourage people to want to see the rest of it. You might think of a teaser in print the same way that you would think of a movie trailer. You're all familiar with movie trailers, right? It's not the whole movie. It's usually within a minute. And it should be enough to make you want to see the whole film. The same way in text, you're doing this with your introduction labels, that you want to encourage people, that you want to do it then in what's called active voice. I talked about active voice in writing earlier in the semester. You know, the difference between saying, I walked to the door, as compared to saying, I bolted for the door. Two entirely different meanings. I ran to the door, or I bolted for the door. I sprang for the door. And they all have different imagery. So you really want to think about language that is active, but is not overinflated, where it actually sets up a false impression of what's going to be in there. So you want it to be saying something significant or special about that main exhibit, and it should be within this introduction label. You're not going to be doing the introduction label for the exhibits you're doing. You'll be doing that for the quiz. And visitors really should understand immediately, in that nutshell, what they're going to see, and it should be enough to make them want to see the entire exhibit. That's why, for example, Judith, when you said you're doing the class of, all right, the people you graduated with, What is it about that class that would make me want to go in? Otherwise, I went to IIA. My class was better than yours. You've got to do something to pique my interest. You have to find out something that's going to make me want to say, okay, you're right, I think I'm bad, but yeah, you're badder. All right, what is it? All right, and once again, though, it cannot be overinflated. You're stating something that's true, something that's interesting. Right? You might think of it in some ways as a headline on an article. So a common introductory label or wall panel that you would see. This pixelates too much. Crap. Reads much better on the screen. In essence, though, storied walls. This is showing various walls throughout America, North and South America, that were covered with murals, of American Indian murals. So in fresco. So for example, this mural here is from a place called Bonampak, right, which is a Maya mural. Well, you can't see it really clearly here, but this is out of South America. That's a Nazca mural. And up here, where you see this face, that is a mural from the Moche culture in South America. But how is it that people portrayed their culture in murals? And that's what this storied walls is about. That's what this exhibit is about. So what this text panel is doing is it's letting you know the theme and why this is a significant exhibit. It's giving you a context so that when you walk through, everything you're presented with in some way falls within the introduction that has been provided for you. You then, once you get past your initial introductory labels, you come to section labels. Now, section labels are kind of like mini introductions. So if that, I'll back it up here. All right, if this was a whole museum that was doing storied walls, then you would look at section labels that as you move through the exhibit, there would be a label related to the Amazon, to Bonampak, to Sun, and I can't remember what the heck that place is, and then the Moche. Right. Each of these are sections then within the overall exhibit. So you encounter this label first, and then you will encounter a smaller set of text that will introduce the particular sections. Does that make sense? So each time you're saying less and less about more and more. So this is kind of a mini introduction then that's of these various subtopics or galleries within a museum exhibition. And it orients the visitor to the section or sections that they are about to encounter. And in essence here, you're really representing then the substance of what's going to be in that gallery or that museum. Right? Because it's becoming much more specific now. Where the first is a very generalized storied walls. And now you're moving to storied walls as they were among the Moche, as they were among the Maya. And if it's a really large section, you're only going to have to worry yourself about one small section with 5 objects or so. But if it was a really large section, you might actually need more than one label. Because, when someone passes 50 objects and they're still in that same section, they may need a little reminder. And if you're doing that, then you need to think about a term called creative redundancy. What does redundant mean? Saying the same thing. And when you're being creatively redundant, then, yes, you're saying the same thing in a slightly different way. And your section label really should be no more than 100 to 200 words. One of the wonderful things about writing labels is it really teaches you the importance of the economy of words. So you learn how to, we'll say, trim away the excess and really get down to the bare essentials, the bare ideas that you need to communicate. Because while a lot of people like to read labels, they're not, in general, most people will not read every object label, every text panel in an exhibit. So you want to make sure, if they're only going to read snippets, that you're giving them the maximum amount of information in the minimum amount of space. This really does challenge your writing abilities, because it's not like writing an essay. In many ways, what you're doing is you're writing an abstract. An abstract is, you might have seen them in the front of a scientific or some other anthropological article, where you'll see something that says abstract, and it'll be a very brief paragraph, and then you scroll down the whole PDF, and the article's like 96 pages long. That abstract is telling you what the other 96 pages are going to tell you. Right? So, because it allows the person to actually decide, is this something that I can use? And in this case, is this something that's worth my time? Because I can go to Disney World, or I can go to this museum. People are making choices on entertainment, how they spend their spare time. Well, I mean, if it's a school, they're kind of a captive audience. But even then, the teachers who are taking them to a museum are making decisions on what's going to give the best information and is going to be the most memorable, enjoyable for the students. We then are becoming even more focused then with object identification labels. And this, in your semester project, is what you're going to be most concerned with. I think for the next part of the assignment, semester project part 4. So these are the smallest labels that are describing every individual object, and these object labels are displayed next to the objects. So it is the most basic information that's usually written in a point form. Now, when I say point form, is that you have lines of text that may not be complete sentences initially, that give the viewer an overall, just a real quick and dirty what it is, and then it may include a little bit of explanatory text. But in general, in point form means it's not going to be complete sentences. It's going to be single ideas. So that would typically might be the title of the work or a descriptive title, because the work itself may not have a title, but the museum is calling it something. All right, so, like this key. It's a key. That's it. But it transforms, once you call it, Fadden's key to the kingdom. It conjures up an entirely different set of imagery. And it infuses it with personality, and for that matter, power. So it's the title or some type of descriptive title. You will have the artist or the culture of origin or the place of origin. You will have the date. And generally, if something, there's a couple of abbreviations that you should become familiar with. ND, for one of them, means no date. And the other one is what? CA. What's CA stand for? What's approximately stand for? Actually, circa. C-I-R-C-A. That means approximately. All right, so, and depending upon the museum you are and the type of objects you're showing, that approximately is going to vary in the number of years. Because if you are in, we'll say, the Museum of Natural History, and you are looking at a dinosaur skeleton, and it says circa whatever year it was, you know that there's going to be easily a 100,000 year span either way from that circa, as compared to an Impressionist painting museum, where when they say circa 1885, it's only going to be about 5 years either way, because of that era of Impressionist painting. Does that make sense? Depending on what type of museum you're in, it's actually going to dictate how you perceive time. You generally will include the materials or the technique of the object, and that includes even for digital work. You may have a brief description or commentary, and then very often the accession number and the accession date. Museums vary on whether they display that information or not. In general then, when you are doing your object labels, they're going to be anywhere from with maybe a one-word title, it depends on the object itself, followed by maybe 25 to 50 words description for a museum label. And people want specific aspects of that object that they may not notice at first glance or might not have already known. So we're going to talk about, to some degree, because you can scale it right down to the title, artist, date, media, accession information. Or you can put it on steroids and give a little bit more of descriptive text. All right, so you'll get varying degrees, but if you're going to use that descriptive text, you want it to include information that is not easily visible to see. Because the person can see it. You don't need to tell them what they already see. So you want to give some type of background information, either about the technique, the media, the artist themselves, the occasion, possibly the provenance. And what's provenance? Do you remember what that is? It's the history of the ownership of that object. Who had it and when they had it. And provenance sometimes is important, because telling you that this key was in the possession of Andy Warhol's collection of keys is going to draw someone's attention much more than saying that it was in Jesse Riker's closet. Why? What's that? Yeah, people are going to, whether they like him or not, they know Warhol. All right, it's a name. It's a name brand. Provenance sometimes is important. So people want to know some of those kinds of specifics, like when it was made, why it was made, how it was used, and when it became part of the museum. And an interesting note about this key, for example, yes, it is the key to the kingdom. I can open every door on campus with this thing. You know what I use it more for? I open boxes with it. You know, tape and stuff on boxes, like ksh, ksh, ksh. That gives you an entirely different look on that key, as well as the personality of the person who owned it. Because that, they're going to think, oh, that's pretty quirky. Rarely uses it on doors. You could get into anybody's office and he chooses to open boxes with it. So when we move into that level of more descriptive information, and we're talking about interpretive labels then, we're telling more about the object than just the identification labels. The interpretive text will usually be written in full sentences and may even include a heading, which could include why the object was important, why the museum collected it, why someone made it, how they made it, something special about that person or object, or something special about the media they used. So as an example, as we look, this is out of the Canadian Museum of civilization. As we look at this altar ornament, all right, you see the object, you see the date. In this case, you see the ethnicity of the person who made it. They don't know the name of the person who made it. So instead, they at least give you a cultural context. A Cambodian Canadian. And that in itself, when we think about combinations of ethnicities, where's Cambodia? Southeast Asia, right there, right next to Vietnam. So what's this person from Cambodia doing in Canada? That in itself is a story, if you can find that out. Does that make sense? Right? That appeals to human interest. All right, and then you'll see that it's made of plastic drinking straws and plastic beads. So what you see right here, and this is really when we're looking at perception then, because a Cambodian immigrant made this hanging ornament to decorate the altar at his Buddhist temple in Ontario. There's another interesting bit of information, a Buddhist temple in Ontario. He used materials available, adopted in his country, Canada, but followed a traditional design. One of the things that makes this really interesting to a viewer is that you have taken so-called profane media. In other words, when I say profane, I'm not talking about cuss words, like profanity. All right, it's just very common. It has no sacred context, but based upon this person's spiritual beliefs, their spiritual practices, they've taken something and they have taken the profanity and they've turned it into something sacred. Plastic drinking straws. The next time you're sitting at McDonald's or wherever, at what is that, Sonic, or wherever you get your drinking straws, and you're looking at that straw, it may actually have an entirely different meaning. And so what you are trying to do in the description of the object, you are trying to infuse either the maker, the object, or the media with a different level of meaning. You are encoding meaning into that object, and if you can, do so in a way that has some type of storytelling or emotional appeal. Because we remember things that activate our emotions, and we remember things that often seem very counter or contrasting to ideas that we already hold. We are more likely to remember something, believe it or not, that we disagree with than something we agree with, because it has triggered an emotional response. So in a very simple label, you've not only described the media, but you've infused it with this spiritual meaning. But also noted that while it's profane material, that it had a traditional intent behind it as a Buddhist. And that this thing made out of plastic and beads hung in a very important place. When you walk into my office, you'll see an altar of monkey homies. They're little monkeys you could buy out of a gumdrop machine. Those machines you put a quarter in, you turn the crank, and you get a little homie. All right, I collect homies, but not real homies. Well, I got a couple homies, yeah. But the ones I really go for, I bet I spent $100 to get all the saints. The saint homies, and I'm not even a Catholic. But I had to have the whole set. I spent easily $100. I mean, what's that? Taco Bell made a fortune on me. All right, but at least I got a homie every time. All right, it's not like a one-armed bandit. All right, but that's something. It's made out of plastic. It's kitsch, but to me, it's very spiritual too. And the same way that I have a deep respect for primates, and so I spent another fortune on the little monkey homies. All right, including the see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil. The relaxing homie, the disinterested homie, and but they're all monkeys. if you just see it out of context, it just looks like a cheap piece of plastic. Once you give it a context, that's where we infuse meaning, we infuse emotion, personality. That we take something that is inert, inanimate, and we have, through the descriptions that we used, breathed life into it. And when you can get people, this is one thing to start to learn to do as a curator. Visit a lot of exhibits, a lot of openings. Don't look at the objects. Look at people looking at the objects. Look at what makes them stop. Pay attention to what they read. And after they've left, go see what it was they were looking at. Because if you see enough people stopping in front of something, there's got to be something there that piqued interest. And if they're stopping in front of a panel of text, you dang well better read it. Because it's a kick-ass piece of text to stop that many people. So when you go to openings and museums, yeah, you can save looking at the objects later. Watch people, watch objects first. And you will learn more by doing that than any class you can take. But thanks for taking this one. An Easter egg. 1988, Ukrainian. It's a chicken egg. And it's important to say that it's a chicken egg. Now, one of the things on both of these, what's missing that you often see in a lot of museum labels? What's that? Dimensions, the size. All right, how do we know that this thing is not 6 feet long? Yeah, we don't. The same way with this. Because on this I could not find the dimensions on it. Nor could I find the dimensions on this. But I do know Ukrainians do not decorate ostrich eggs. There's no ostriches up there. All right, so okay, I almost put my eye out. All right, so dimensions are important sometimes because they give us a sense of the human scale. Because this could almost pass for a curtain. So calling it a chicken egg with acrylic paint as the media, as once again with the accession number or the catalog number. And then the information on here. Brightly colored Ukrainian Easter egg has a purple base and triangular design. The designer created it in Manitoba. She usually boiled the eggs since this helped the colors keep longer. She used a commercial kishka stylus for her designs. Kishka is a little bone, right? And it's a very rough way of painting, but you can actually achieve some amazing detail with that little bone, including a little chicken bone. Have you ever seen on chicken, on the drumsticks, there's that one little bone you want to make sure it doesn't get caught in your neck? It almost looks like a little dagger. Right? It's actually very flexible, and you can achieve some amazing fine line detail using that as a stylus. But it's a tool also with which hot wax can be drawn onto an egg, and then it's a process of wax and dye resist. So you have someone from the Ukraine. Where's Ukraine? Sorta, kinda. It's in that real gray area between what we would call Europe and Russia, the steppes. All right, it's in that gray area because it was once USSR. It fell within that one of these Soviet socialist republics, the Ukraine. So here's someone from the Ukraine in Manitoba. Where's Manitoba? Canada. It's one of the provinces of Canada. So that in itself could be, if we knew the artist, could be an interesting bit of information. What is it that brought that person from the Ukraine to Canada? Because the year that this occurred, 1988, if you do a little research of what's going on in this part of the world in 1988, it's around the time the wall is going to fall, but the Berlin Wall is Germany. But it still relates to the collapse of communism. And then another label you may be using is a credit panel. And actually, the practice related to a credit panel as a label varies, even including who specific donors are and the dates that something was obtained or donated. Now, this is an important thing to remember in donations, because there are some individuals or entities who will donate to a museum and want no credit for it. It's an anonymous donation. There are other entities that want to build goodwill, which means that they want to have their name associated with that donation. They want people to know that they gave that gift. It's a tax write-off way of doing advertisement. So there are sometimes objects you may take in for an exhibit where one of the specifications to be able to access this object means that you have to not only publicly acknowledge who the donor was, they may even specify that you have it on the actual object label. A gift of the da-da-da-da foundation. If something is loaned, and that means either on loan from another individual, another museum, another institution, that may also appear on the credit panel. And sometimes there may be the specification from that entity that they want that on the object label, not on a credit panel. But they want people to know specifically what they gave. Many curators and exhibit designers are of the belief that putting donor information on an object label actually makes it clutter. Right? That it's actually too much information, and it actually is best to have it on a separate credit panel. And it depends, once again, on the institution with which we work, on what we are going to put on that object label and what type of credence, or what we might call wall space, that we will give to donors. But it is a measure of goodwill, not only in the part of the donor, but for the entity, the museum that is receiving the object, to give that kind of recognition. Because when you give that kind of recognition, it keeps the donating individuals or organizations much more willing to donate things again in the future, because they know they will be recognized. But that becomes sometimes one of the sticking points in obtaining objects on loan, or for that matter, accepting outright donations, because what strings are attached with it? So if we were to look at text labels and label content, and kind of this hybrid of them both. An interpretive label is the one that is usually written in full sentences, and gives the audience or the viewer a context in which to place something. Gives them a little bit more information that's not readily available as compared to the descriptive, which is your title, artist, date, and the like. Media. That the interpretive label is going to be written in an active voice. You're telling a story. As compared to the descriptive, which is going to be much more passive because you have very few verbs in a descriptive label. What's the verb in Mona Lisa? There isn't one. So that's going to be passive. Active is going to be complete sentences. Passive is going to be more of your point by point. So if we want to write labels that work, we want to start with information that is directly related to what visitors can see. So it is the object, possibly feel, and that means not only tactile, but emotionally, what they can do, smell, or experience from where they're standing. Something that drives me crazy is when I go to moccasin exhibits, particularly if they're from Canada. Yeah, I want to pick them up and smell them. And you can't. Have you ever smelled moose hide smoked? It's beautiful. It's such a beautiful. You don't like it? I love that smell. Of course, I'm from up that way, so it's very, very familiar. When it's been hickory smoked, because that's what turns that kind of creamy colored moose hide, and that's what gives it that rich brown color is the smoking. And it leaves it with the smell of hickory smoke. And when I buy moccasins, when I used to live up north, I'd smell them first. Try this sometime. Next time you go into a sneaker store, instead of trying them on, pick them up and start sniffing the shoes. All right, watch what the salespeople do. All right, people don't buy sneakers based on smell. I buy moccasins based on smell. And if I'm at an exhibit and they're showing that kind of object, I will, with that experience already, when I see a particular design in beadwork or quill work on a certain style of moccasin, it will instantly conjure up that smell, even though it's not readily there in front of me. It will instantly bring that memory back. Have you ever burnt out a clutch? Anyone here? It's got a distinct smell. Oh, so you're popping the clutch, or? Uh-huh. Ah, dang. All right, so you know what it smells like. All right, there is this smell that stays with you. You smelled it once. Popcorn. When we think, believe it or not, sometimes a museum is just as olfactory as it is visual. One class that I taught years ago, I challenged a class to create an exhibit that people had to know what it was with their eyes closed. So as you walked from exhibit to exhibit, they had no sight. It was for blind people. So they had to rely on sound, touch, and smell. It was a great exhibit. Yeah, that's sound. Yeah. So, what is it? All right, what is the information you can give them right at first glance from where a person is? And then being flexible, because when you write all labels the exact same way, they start to become very boring. So even within a certain system, try to be creatively redundant. You also want to make sure that the labels themselves are interrelated, one object to the next, as well as the object within a specific gallery or setting. So you want to make sure that whether it's the introductory panels, your object labels, your recognition, or your donor labels, you want to make sure that you write for your audience. Know who your audience is and write to the approximate education or cultural orientation level of that audience. When we're talking about text hierarchy, they call it orders of subordination, putting more important items first and then less important afterward. You want to make sure that you're organized within that context. You want to allow people to be able to engage with the object. That means being active. That's holding their interest. And you do that in a very important way by bringing in that human element. But once again, this depends on the museum. Once again, if you're in a natural history museum, if you've ever been to the one in DC on the Mall, you walk in and there's this giant T-Rex. All right, now it's really difficult to put that in a human element. There are ways to do it, though, that allow people to relate. I mean, naturally, you see those big choppers, all right? You don't need to put a mannequin sticking out of its mouth like Jurassic Park. Right, but you may put something of human scale next to it, or in a descriptive panel, how many years away from the very first Homo sapiens, for example, did this creature walk the earth? So I kind of use the analogy that when you're doing a label, it's almost like packing or unpacking for a trip. Right? That when you're thinking about the length of a label, it's like packing, and you think about 3 separate piles. You think about the things you would like to take, or everything you would like to say about that object, the things that you think you need, and then the things you absolutely cannot get along without. The bare essentials, and then take only the third group when you're doing an object label. If you have the latitude to be able to give more of a descriptive text, then you would add the next level of things we think we need. All right, what is it that can introduce the story, the more human element? But you at least want to give people, the bare essentials, and that will be the object title, creator, year, media, dimensions. But ideally, you want people to walk away from that exhibit enlightened, enriched, knowing more about that individual or that category than when they entered. Generally, artist, title, year, dimensions won't do it. That's why interpretive text is so important. So sometimes you might think of yourself being in crunch time. That there may have been something you were planning, an exhibit you were planning, and it literally 2 weeks before it was supposed to be mounted, it fell through, and you've got to get something up really quick. And that's when what you cannot get along without. You may have to start with those labels, and it's okay to add stuff later. Nothing is written in stone that once a label's there, it's unchangeable. It's like, it's not like the Bible. Right? It is malleable. You can change the label. You can add to it. So if we're thinking about a label as a short story, This is the interpretive, the more elaborated. It's going to be active language. You will have someone or something that is talking about in a certain context and why it's significant. So you do have, for example, a reproduced photograph. All right, it's telling you what the object is and what's being depicted. A man wearing a headdress, the year that the photograph would have been taken, and where it was taken, the Marquesas Islands, and then accession number. And then William McM. Woolworth produced this studio photograph as a way for Western audiences to experience an exotic culture. This man's tattoos fascinated Western audiences, but were also a way to convey adulthood and served as visual armor to ward off malevolent spirits and human enemies in his Polynesian culture. That tells you quite a bit about tats. Because when people think about tattoos today, they think of them as adornment, very often as fashion. It's become so commonplace, you just, oh, another tattoo. When I was a kid, when someone wore a tattoo, that was an anomaly. And they were generally frowned upon. People tended to equate them either with gangs, or in Japan in particular, gangsters, the Yakuza, heavily tattooed people, the Japanese mafia. They equated them with sailors, lowlifes, and gangs in this country. They're still connected with gangs, but they're also a fashion statement. By the way, if you're thinking to get a tattoo, bad idea. Not because of the adornment, they rot your liver. The ink is toxic. Tattoos fade. Do you know why they fade? Because your liver is saying, I've got poison in me, get this crap out of here. And it's pulling that ink. And it gets congested into your liver. I'd love to get tattoos. I'm old enough now where I'll die before they fade. I don't want to rot my liver. But this notion, visual armor, not because it's cool, not because I'm in some gang, not because I'm representing somebody or some entity, but armor to ward off malevolent beings. I'm wearing this tattoo to protect me. And this is when we talk about the real tribal tattoos. That's what a lot of tattoos were intended to do. They were medicine. They were armor. They were like amulets or medallions that you would wear. Or they even showed social station. Have you ever heard of the Maori culture? And a kind of tattoo that's called moko. Total facial tattoo. And when you see one of the Maori men or women who have moko tattoos and they're doing a haka, that's intense stuff. A haka is a chant they do where they beat their chests and stick their tongues out at you and bulge their eyes out. And it's a really astounding display to watch. And it is a very spiritual thing. A haka doesn't mean they're trying to kick your ass. It may be a greeting. But an important part of it, to show your station, is your moko tattoo. Not everyone could get a moko. So when we think of tattoos, what this person has done with this label has shown, yes, it's not only adulthood, but armor, giving you another context. And it's a spiritual armor for malevolent spirits as well as human enemies. That's a story. That's a significance. So that when you see the tattoos on this man's leg, it gives you another context. Because for people in the United States or in the Western audiences, that includes England, France, this was very bizarre. This was very primitive. And yet, among his own people, Ho-hum, another tattoo. It's taking something very, very strange and turning it into something familiar. It's still providing some type of context, some type of story, some type of significance.